Good afternoon. I'm Don Cobb. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's lecture in the Heritage Series. I'm here to do two things. First, the safety brief. So let's do that first. Sort of like if you're in an airplane for our guests, we have two exits in the front, only one in the back. To reassure you, we don't expect that we'll need to know that, but in case, just in the off chance that we would, as you exit through these exits, you'll see a parking lot across the street, and that's the muster area. And we do want to keep track of everybody, so that would be good. But as I said, that's only a precaution. The other reason that I'm here is also significant. I wanted to say a couple of words about John Hopkins and his team who have put together this Heritage Series. I don't know, John, is it a couple of years now, 3 years? In that 3 years and counting, and hopefully will continue. This is a place of history, and it's not something to be lost. And so these people, if you've been to any of these previously, some have been classified, some unclassified, and I haven't been able to be at all of them, but the ones that I have seen have been tremendously interesting, but also meaningful for this community. And so it's a place with a great future, but it's a past that we want to remember. And today we have a special guest, and John will tell you about her. So, John?
Thank you very much, Don, for the very kind comments. I must say that this has been the funnest project to put together, but it was also an enormous amount of work, and I really appreciate the help of secretaries, and I've had some from the director's office, and that's been very worthwhile. We have a rare opportunity today to get a first-hand glimpse into the daily workings of the highest administrative and technical levels of wartime Los Alamos. Our guest this afternoon, who is J. Robert Oppenheimer's secretary, will give us her perspective on the inner circle of Site Y in the months leading up to the establishment of Los Alamos and what it was like to serve our country with the many famous scientists. Priscilla Green graduated from the University of California at Berkeley in June of 1939 and immediately went off to Europe as a tourist. She visited France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and England over the next 8 months. I should remind you that World War II started with the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. In June of 1942, she went to work for E.O. Lawrence, and soon after for J. Robert Oppenheimer. She was very close to Oppie all through the formative period of Los Alamos. During her tenure at Los Alamos, she married a young chemist by the name of Robert Duffield. Her personnel file states that Priscilla Duffield was Oppie's, and I quote, confidential secretary, runs director's office, supervises mailroom, acts for all important visitors, and is secretary to the governing board. I want to add that we had planned to have two other distinguished ladies from Oppenheimer's staff join us today. The first is Beverly Agnew. That's not the most flattering picture of Beverly Agnew. The second is Marge Bradner. Beverly, by the way, was the secretary for Robert Bacher, who was effectively the deputy of the laboratory, and Marge Bradner, who, by the way, was recruited by Priscilla Duffield. Unfortunately, health-related issues prevent them from participating. We also recently learned that Priscilla Duffield's successor as Oppenheimer's principal secretary, Ann Wilson Marks, died on March 10th. Please welcome a most distinguished lady who worked so long and so hard on the Manhattan Project that ultimately led to the end of World War II, almost 61 years ago, Priscilla Green Duffield. Before we start, however, I would like to comment on Priscilla's husband. Bob Duffield to his friends as Duff, eventually became director of the Argonne National Laboratory. In 1973, after his tenure at Argonne, Duff and Priscilla returned to the Southwest, where he rejoined Los Alamos for another 5 years and was the Q Division leader. Unfortunately, Duff passed away on December 26, 2000, and Priscilla now lives in Norwood, Colorado, just northwest of Telluride. I would like to mention two other distinguished guests, both born in Los Alamos. The first is Priscilla's eldest daughter, Libby Borkman, and this is the most recent picture we have.
I wish I could see that.
The second was Libby's and Priscilla's friend, Marilyn Kirst, whose father was wartime group leader Donald Kirst, inventor of the Betatron. After several very distinguished ladies, all of whom are either present or former secretaries of Los Alamos directors, are present today. And would you, ladies, please stand? I particularly want to identify Bob Kukuk's secretary, Corinne Ortiz, who is the one in the middle. Corinne, incidentally, is also a veteran of the Berkeley Rad Lab. Now a word on format. I will ask Priscilla questions that we prepared ahead of time, and I hope in this way we can elicit her perceptions of this period. After our questions, we will invite your questions or comments from the floor, and we will finish by 3 o'clock. Let's open the conversation, Priscilla, by inviting you to tell us about when and how you started working for the University of California. And did you start out with E.O. Lawrence?
Yes, and I started working for the University of California because I came out from New York looking out to do something about the war effort, and my mother, and then I just sort of slept late, and my mother, who worked for the university and knew the employment officer, called me up and said, "She's got a job for you, you better go down there." So I went down, and the job was Ernest Lawrence's secretary, because his secretary had just married Glenn Seaborg, who, what was so funny about that? He was the guy who named and discovered, I guess discovered is the word, plutonium. And he went to the metallurgical laboratory in Chicago, so she went with him. So that was how come Lawrence didn't have a secretary. And I went there. And do you want me to go on with this in this same vein? Okay. And he had a lovely office on the top floor of one of the old Berkeley buildings under the mansard roof. And Oppenheimer had an office on the floor below, and he would come to Ernest and say, "Can I use your secretary for a little bit?" And then I ran the summer conference, which is mentioned in a lot of places, and it was great people and just lovely. And Oppie would give me letters, and he was a very good dictator and would spell the names and that sort of thing. And then General Groves showed up, and he was in Ernest's office, and they talked on the telephone. And it's hard to believe now, but it was the first time I was ever asked to make a long distance call. Can anybody imagine? I was terrified. And it was a little hard to find whoever General Groves wanted. He was somewhere all over the country, and I finally did, which was kind of a triumph. And they decided they were going to go on this little tour, and they went. And when they came back, after a little while, Oppie said, "I was in the most beautiful place the other day, and I think I may go out there." And I said, "Take me too." And he said yes, and I think he may even have had that in mind. Do you want me to
say a few words about that summer conference, because that was a critical conference for the nuclear weapons program?
Absolutely. It was a great bunch of people, starting with Bethe. Oh, God, my memory's going. And Teller and Fermi, I think. Was Fermi there? Yeah. No, I don't think so.
I don't know.
Okay, well, I thought I had those names all lined out.
Serber was one.
Serber and Konopinski.
Tolman?
And, no. Richard?
Yes.
I don't think he was there.
I defer to you.
Well, I think I would have remembered, because he was certainly a fellow one remembered, you
The
know.
reason I think that is that in Serber's book, The Los Alamos Primer, he gives Tolman credit for the implosion idea.
Well, that may be, but I don't think he was at the
Okay.
conference.
Maybe that's right. Maybe I was discerning.
He does rather than Neddemeyer?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just trying to go back and think of who else was at that thing, because I sort of remember it by their wives. Van Vleck.
Mm-hmm.
Van Vleck was a railroad buff. He spent all his time in the office reading the railway guide, which nobody knows how to read anymore, and I happen to know how to read, happened to then. So I enjoyed talking to him, and I don't, offhand at the moment, I don't remember who else.
Was there security at that summer conference?
There was at the radiation lab, I think, yeah, at Lawrence's lab. I think, but I'm not sure. There wasn't any, we didn't have any security.
You didn't at the summer?
Not in Berkeley. We had security when we went to Santa Fe, but we didn't have any security.
Well, tell us a little bit about planning for Los Alamos. When did that really start?
Well, it started, in order to decide what you wanted, where you wanted to go, you had to think a little bit about what you needed, and so they thought about what they needed. It was quite a considered thing, and then but you're talking about organizational planning. And I guess it started very shortly after the summer conference, no, in the fall, in the early fall. The first person they hired was an accountant, Duane Muncie. And then they hired a procurement officer who was a fellow from Columbia named Dana Mitchell, who was supposed to be the best scientific procurement officer in the country, and he was pretty terrific, there's no question about it, but he was also very fierce. And let's see, who else did get those? I mean, those were serious planning things. And then, but who was going to be the heads of the departments and who was going to do the science was pretty much determined by who came to the conference, as I recall, except that Robbie didn't come. And
this was the summer of 1942 and the fall of 1942, and they thought that there would be about 100 people at Los Alamos?
The number, yeah, there's 100 scientists and 365 people all told.
I see. They were off a little bit.
Oh my God! I mean, they even knew it.
Who were some of the major players? Was John Manley involved in the
He was
planning?
Enormously involved in the planning, that's right. And I mean, he was the one who went tearing all around the country and getting people to explaining to people what it was about and what they should do and how they could come when their families could come and all that sort of thing. And he was very good at that.
Some of the books on Oppenheimer say that Manley was frustrated at Robert Oppenheimer's reluctance to actually work out an organization for the laboratory.
Yeah, well, I keep thinking about that and remembering somebody saying, here's your damn organization chart, but it was not. It was not Robert, and it was not John Manley, it was Robert Wilson, because I also worked for the lab which became the National Accelerator Laboratory, and I worked for Robert. And I sometimes get the two things were kind of similar. I mean, as a future, as a planning sort of thing, they had some connection, and except Robert Wilson didn't like me, but he was stuck with me. So.
Now, why didn't he like you?
Well, he thought I was going to tell him what to do all the time. He was absolutely right.
Sound familiar?
Well, yeah, he had every reason to think so and to use that excuse, and I don't. We actually in the end got along okay, but it was a different sort of situation.
How did you transition from Berkeley to Los Alamos?
God, it wasn't much of a transition. I was doing the same thing for the same people. And we were so, in Berkeley, we were so confined in a small space. So when I got to Los Alamos, although I thought the country was absolutely marvelous, and I really enjoyed the freedom to do things there, it wasn't much of a transition. It was the same thing. It was the same people, the same ideas, the same problems. And
yours and Oppie's first office was in Santa Fe, was it not?
There was an office in Santa Fe which Dorothy McKibben manned, but that was the first place, and I was just trying to think about it. She wasn't in it then, quite then, but very soon thereafter. The other thing that got very mixed up there is that I was there, but then I got the measles, which wasn't any help at all to anybody. Fortunately, nobody else got them. And I was taken to, what's it? It's a dude ranch. And Reenchantment? No. I'll think of it. No. It was a small, scientists had started to come then, and they were put out in ranches. And Rancho Encantado? Okay.
When did you get here?
I got here on the 23rd of February. Do you think that's reasonable?
Seems reasonable to me. That's early. But they were hard at work with bulldozers and things, I think.
Well, things went amazingly fast, just incredibly fast. There was no phone line up to Los Alamos when we got here. And the phone line went in and finally it was working. But the office started working up there with a Forest Service phone. And it wasn't very good.
How long were you in Santa Fe, and when did you move up here?
Well, I guess I was in Santa Fe with the measles and everything for a couple of months, and then
you moved up here.
Yeah.
Where was your office up here? Using today's landmarks, if you can.
Well, it was something called T Building, which was, here's Trinity, and here's Fuller Lodge. And T Building was just and the fence was on this side I'm not sure where the compass points are, but it was on the west side of Trinity, and T Building was right up against the fence.
That's about where Los Alamos Inn is now.
I think that's correct, yeah. Which we had a terrible time finding today, 'cause they moved the sign.
It looks different.
I think that's right, absolutely.
What were your first impressions of Los Alamos when you got up here?
I was so busy, I don't know that I really had any. It was certainly a mess. And the Secretary of the Regents of the University of California was here, and Oppie was very suspicious of him, nervous about him. So he made me come along and ride in the car and look at things, and because he really wanted to get the University of California going on this because it needed more work. And so we drove around, and I must say, it wasn't very impressive. and we looked at it, and the Secretary of the Regents, whose name I've forgotten in a moment, but it'll come.
Underhill.
Oh, yes. It's no wonder I forget. Every time I hear it, I shudder. Yeah, well, he was, I had known about Underhill and known these people because of my mother being in the university and that sort of thing. As a matter of fact, I remember his waking me up when I had the flu because he needed to talk to me about something. He couldn't find anybody else to talk to, so he called me. But he and Robert and I rode around, and I took some notes, and it was a really prepossessing, and furthermore, you couldn't imagine doing any work in it. It was just nothing. I mean, just unfinished buildings and mud and trucks, and it was not very encouraging.
What was it like to live here at that time? Where did you live?
Well, first everybody lived in ranches in the valley, as I said.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I came up, I lived in a dormitory, which was out over what's the next canyon? I mean, there's Los Alamos Canyon. That's Los Alamos Canyon, isn't it?
That's Los Alamos Canyon.
Okay, well.
Mm-hmm. To the north of us.
Yeah. And so there was a men's dorm and a women's dorm and 2 messes, and that was where I lived, and that was where we ate when we couldn't find any better place. And I lived there until I got married. No, that can't be right. No, I think I managed to get graded somehow or other, so I didn't have to live in that dorm anymore. Don't remember.
There should be some perks to being the director's secretary.
Well, there were, but that wasn't really the deal. The deal was that there weren't any places, and I didn't use that kind of clout very much. This wasn't anything else.
Thinking of Duff, how did you meet him here?
I met him in the cafeteria. What was it? Yeah, he came. Yes, and he came over and asked me if I'd like to go to the movies. And I happened to have another friend at that point. So I told him that I couldn't right now, but then later that friend had other things to do, and so I went and asked him if he'd go to the movies.
Some of the books on Oppenheimer say that you got some advice along this line from Oppie.
Oh, well, that's true. It was not particularly helpful, but he was always doing that. He thought very hard about marriage, which is kind of peculiar because his own marriage wasn't as easy as it could be. But he asked me one time to ask somebody else, to suggest to somebody else that she didn't really need to marry that guy, which I refused to do, I'm happy to say. And I'm not going to mention her name either. And then, because she's been married happily to that same fellow for at least 50 years. And then when I was going to get married, I'm trying to remember how it went. At any rate, I remember ending up, there was a car called the Buick. It was a lovely big car, and that was what was used for ceremonial kind of occasions in General Groves. And he was supposed to meet General Groves in Cheyenne or someplace like that, when the train went through. It was a very bad time for when he met General Groves because he was being seriously investigated at that point. But he said I should come out and sit in the car with him while he waited for the driver to leave. And he said, you know, are you sure you want to marry this guy? And he had an alternative, but I told him I was sure I wasn't. Thanks just the same, but I was going to get married to him. He then, at some point, was in Berkeley, and he told my mother that he thought that it was a pretty good marriage, and she said, well, that's fine. I don't know whether I should tell this or not. Well, I guess it's all a part of history. He should. I think there are good standards. You have good standards for marriage, and he said to me after he told me, they said that was a very peculiar thing to say, which if you knew anything about Robert's marriage, it probably was.
Tell us a little bit about your job. What did you do between 7:30 in the morning and 5 or 6 at night?
Well, I did the usual secretarial things, which is I took dictation, for example. And it was a great pleasure. Oppie dictated very well. He spoke in complete sentences. And he didn't go too fast. It was really marvelous. He didn't mind my editing his letters, which was nice too. But I mean, everybody has to edit some people's letters. And I answered the telephone and fended off Edward Teller. Well, there was a certain amount of that. Lots of people wanted to see him, and so I did the usual, just things that secretaries did in those days, or in all days.
Probably the same today, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
When did you learn about what the mission was of Los Alamos? At the 1942 summer study, or?
I think it was when we were up in LeConte Hall, and it was a summer study. And in the office next to the one we were using as a project office, these were all professors had all gone to war, and other people had taken over their offices. And I went into the one next to it for some reason, and there was a picture of a bomb on the wall, and that was it. I mean, it was just there.
Might tip you off.
Yeah, right.
Did you have a sense that you were making history?
Well, it's certainly not something I dwelled on at all. No, I don't think so. It's not the sort of thing I think, I guess. But some people certainly thought history was being made, and that's quite reasonable. I remember when I had the measles, there was a professor of philosophy at Berkeley who I guess was quarantined with me. That was it. And so he asked me, do people think about what they're doing? Are they talking about what they're doing, and do they want it? Do they like it? And I said, I didn't think anybody was talking about it. It's the sort of thing a guy might talk to his wife about, but he wasn't supposed to tell his wife all these things, so maybe they really didn't discuss it, I think. But by the end of the war, people were certainly very exercised about how it should be used.
I would like to get back to that in a few
Okay.
minutes. Were there many women at the laboratory at that time? And
Not until the wax came.
did they have any special problems, or were they just part of the group?
I don't think the wax have any special problems. Mm-hmm. Well, they had problems being wax. I mean, that's true. They were stuck in a not very good dormitory with not very good food, and I don't think they were supposed to fraternize, but I don't think that was a big deal. It was just being a whack was not the loveliest thing to be in this situation, because other people were, well, as far as the special engineering division was the male counterpart of that, and some of them had scientific training and were getting army wages and working next to people who were getting a reasonable amount of money. And the WACs were sort of the same, except there weren't very many females who were doing the sort of things, the WAC, doing stenographic and secretarial work and things like that.
Now, is it true that Groves tried to get Oppenheimer to do something about the burgeoning birth rate here?
Well, in Groves, certainly. I mean, he didn't think it was such a great idea, but I guess maybe he said something to Abby, but if he did, it certainly, Abby wasn't going to have anything to do with that. I mean, he wasn't going to interfere with that sort of thing. What Groves said was, a house only has to have 3 bedrooms, the apartment, because there are only 2 sexes. And I've been trying to work that out ever since. Well, its idea is a man and his wife and one boy and 1 girl, I guess. And so that's 3 bedrooms. If you had 1 more bedroom, all hell would break loose.
Tell us a little more about your working relationship with Oppenheimer. What was he like?
Oh, yeah, why is this so difficult? He was marvelous to work for because he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he was very explicit about the things that he needed to do, but he also listened to anything you said, and he was sure fast with a cigarette lighter. In those days we smoked all the time, so I'd pull out a cigarette and he would be dictating and this lighter would flash in front of him. He was extremely considerate and extremely smart, and most of the time he didn't worry about. Well, I remember his telling me that one time he told me Groves does those things on purpose. I guess I've already said that. I've said it somewhere today anyway. But he didn't, well, it wasn't a big deal, any of it. Working for him was not a big deal. It was just something you could do, and he would tell you what you wanted, what he needed to have done, and you could do it, and then you could make sure that other people got to see him, and it was a very straightforward job.
Tell us a little bit more about working with General Groves.
Well, have I already told you about don't you ever wash your hands?
No, you told me, but I don't think.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, the laboratory was not terribly well run, and there were sliding doors between offices, which was a good idea. And so he was going through the sliding door, and I don't know, we don't have much in the way of cleaners, so the door really was pretty grubby down the side. And he looked at it for a minute, and then he turned around and looked at me and Shirley Barnett and said, "Don't you ladies ever wash your hands?"
Well, how was he viewed by Oppenheimer and by the other senior people at the lab?
Well, some of them viewed him, well, Oppenheimer understood Groves and got along very well with him. And he was a little suspicious about what Groves would like to say. He liked to have me on the telephone when Groves was talking. And Oppie asked him a question one time, and Groves said, "Well, I'll answer that if she'll get off the line." But on the whole, Oppie really respected Groves, and he also, I guess, told you that he wasn't as mean as he appeared to be, which is true. And I think that they had a very respectful, understanding relationship, and Groves felt he was very lucky to have him, and that is so surprising because you can't imagine two people who appeared more unlike, but it was just very good.
Why do you think Groves selected Oppenheimer?
Well, because Groves was smarter than he looked. I think, well, one of the big things was how you were going to recruit people. And he knew that Robert would be a good person to recruit other scientists because a lot of people were working on radar at MIT at that point, and it was some of them were going to have to be pulled off, and so it wasn't easy to get people to come, and people thought this was a pretty outlandish idea. So I think it was mostly because he thought Robert. He wasn't sure about his directorial abilities, but he may have guessed. But he did think he'd be a good recruiter because he was popular and had good understanding. And he also knew that Robert knew what he was supposed to be doing, what the job was.
Harold Agnew said one time at one of our meetings here that he thought that Groves deserved more credit than he was given, and that if he were tall and not fat, he'd be a national hero.
Yes, I remember.
Do you think that's...
Well, he didn't. It would be hard for him to be a national. It wasn't because he was short. Well, he wasn't terribly short. He was fat though. But he didn't act like a national hero, and he didn't put himself forward in that way. I'm not sure I know what Harold means by that.
Did you interact much with Oppenheimer's family?
Not very much, no. Kitty was a difficult person to get along with. The only ones I interacted with, and later mostly, I knew Frank very well, and Frank and his wife Jackie. So, well, but that was later.
Tell us a little bit about your view during the war. Did you mentioned that his marriage wasn't necessarily a good example.
Yes, that's right. Well, during the war, I certainly, I think all secretaries do this in certain situations. You're not going to get mixed up with some guy's wife. You're not going to allow yourself to be drawn into any of this, so I wasn't. And Dorothy McKibben did all that. No, Dorothy. The things that Kitty wanted were usually trying to get something from Santa Fe. So she talked to Dorothy McKibben, and Dorothy McKibben would get it up there. And the only time I ever knew anything about it was when Dorothy said, "Look, I've got this problem that Kitty wants a goose for Christmas, and the goose the only one I can find has a broken neck." So I said, "We'll send it up and we'll explain it."
Did you get any feeling from Oppenheimer's other colleagues, the other senior scientists here, about their view of Kitty?
Not then.
Afterwards?
Sometimes, yeah. Ken Bainbridge, I told you that, haven't I? Well, I will tell you or tell somebody else, but this was considered a bit later that he said we always called her bitch Kitty. I mean, it's too bad to say things like that, but she was a really very difficult person, and she made life very hard for Robert, and continued to.
Did Robert protect you from Kitty?
Well, if he did. He just told Kitty not to pick on me, not to get mixed up with me. I suspect he did that, because she never gave me a bit of trouble, except after that first keep the door closed. But and so I think he must have said to Kitty, you know, don't confuse things. Don't try to do anything with Priscilla. I mean, that would be a sensible thing to do, and I'm assuming that's what he did, but I don't know.
You mentioned earlier that Oppenheimer was under surveillance.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that period in his life and what?
You mean about what caused him to be under surveillance?
Yes, and how extensive it was, how visible it was.
Well, it was very visible because the G2 guys, I think it was, that's the military one, sat right outside my door. I mean, he sat in the hall, and he just sat there all the time. He was a very pleasant fellow.
That is fairly obvious, so.
Oh, yeah, well, we all knew that this surveillance was going on, but nobody paid very much attention to it.
Tell us a little bit about how this started and what initiated that.
What, the surveillance?
Yes.
Well, now, this is just from hearsay and what I read. I really think, you know, there was a guy in the Shell Oil Company in Berkeley or El Cerrito or someplace like that who was a communist organizer. And there was a question of whether Haakon Chevalier, who was a very good friend of Robert's, lived right near him, was associated with him. And then there was a question of whether Robert had joined an organization, an affiliated communist organization, along with Haakon. It was always pretty small stuff, but that was what kept bringing these people back. And I remember that there was one of the security people was a guy named Pierre de Silva, who actually was on the laboratory staff, I think. And he told me that he had sent people, and gone himself perhaps, to my mother's house to look and see whether she could, in Berkeley, to see whether there was anything. Oh, my mother had a fire, and they went to see whether that had possibly been set by somebody, or whether it was trying to destroy something. Weird.
Presumably they didn't find anything? Or
well, no. Not my mother. She was the dean of women.
Well, what in Oppenheimer's past prompted them to be so interested in him?
Well, I think they were pulling it. There wasn't very much. Mostly it was his association with Kitty, I think, because she had been married to a guy. Boy, I'm hoping I certainly knew something about this at the time, but not very much. And so they wanted to know how much that had influenced Robert, and I think they never found anything whatsoever that he had anything to do with any of this. And Hakon Chevalier had also been a member of this group, and he was a good friend of Robert's. And let me see, was there somebody else? There wasn't much, and I think they were just fishing.
Was some of this, or what fraction of this was protecting Oppenheimer, and what fraction was investigating Oppenheimer?
Oh, the protecting was I think was quite different. The protecting was just that the Post, somebody from the Post was always posted outside his house. One of the military guys, and they weren't investigating.
When he went traveling, did he go with protection?
As far as Lamy, I guess, and then I think that he just went, it's hard to imagine. No, I don't think he had any protection. I don't think, but I don't know for sure. But he would go, and meet General Groves on the train in up north there, wherever it was, and there wouldn't be any. Somebody may have driven with him, but then there wouldn't be any protection. But they may have gone when he went to the Pecos, to his ranch in the Pecos. I think maybe somebody went over with him.
Did Oppenheimer get many opportunities to go over to his place in the Pecos during the war?
No. They didn't have any time.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about Frank Oppenheimer, Robert's brother.
Yes. Well, very smart guy, very nice guy. He did something very stupid. He also established and ran and maintained that famous place in San Francisco called the Exploratorium. Mm-hmm. And that was a great place, and that was something he loved doing, and he was very happy with. But he went to the University of Minnesota, I guess right after the war, and told them, and they were having, lots of universities were having loyalty oath things, and if you signed them, you said you had never been a member of the party or something, and he signed it. And that was a stupid thing to do because he had been a member of the party. And he said, I kind of hate to tell this, but he said, I did it because I thought that was what they wanted me to do. And that wasn't very bright. Got him in terrible trouble.
What did he do then? What trouble did he get into?
Well, he got fired from the University of Minnesota, and he went back to Blanco Basin in Colorado, where he had a ranch, and he ranched for quite a few years, and then he went to San Francisco and started the Exploratorium. We used to go up and see his ranch, and I've known Frank quite well for a long time. Know his wife, his wife, now it was his second wife, I guess.
And when did he come to Los Alamos?
Well, it was pretty late. I would think it was probably in 45 or something like that. I'm not absolutely certain. I don't remember what he did, and I don't ever remember seeing him there. I don't really remember seeing him there. But I should. I'm sorry.
Thinking of Frank, let's talk about some of the other people you met here, like Hans Bethe and
sure, yeah.
Robert Bacher, and tell us a little bit about your interactions with these people.
Well, they're just such lovely people. It's hard to say that I had any real interactions. When they needed something, they talked to me, and I would do whatever I could. And Robert Bacher, I've known for many years now, and know very well. I think, and the same as Hans. I don't ever see because he's in the East, but I've seen Rose, and he's come out. Actually, Hans came. People admire these people. I'm happy to tell somebody in Norwood, well, Hans Bethe, you say he's a good man. He stood right there one day because they came out to go walking in Ouray, and then we went up on some land we have near Norwood, and it was lovely. I am friends with these people. They feel that I'm a friend, and that just comes out of the atmosphere at Los Alamos where everybody was in it together.
Well, that brings to mind Edward Teller then.
Well, that happens. It happens all the time. I don't know, I've probably told you or told somebody already today about meeting Edward at UCSD, which is the University of California, San Diego, and he's coming down the hall and he holds his arms out like, and I just walked right past him. It gave me great pleasure.
Well, how was his interaction with Oppenheimer?
Well, Edward always had some particular project that he was interested in, and he would not give it up to do anything that the main project of Los Alamos wanted, and that made him not very useful, as you can imagine. And so Robert mostly didn't want to see him at all. He didn't want to waste time with him.
Didn't he agree to see him after Bethe fired him, 1 hour a week or
something like that is probably correct, but I seem to remember. I remember seeing them. I don't remember that it's ever happened. I think he saw him in Bethe's office or something like that. I don't remember his coming.
So one of your jobs was to protect Robert from Edward.
Yeah, but that wasn't really very difficult. Well, Edward didn't just keep coming and trying to see Robert because he knew he wasn't going to get to, so that sort of was the end of it.
How about Robert Serber?
Well, I'm devoted to Robert Serber, and he, of course, one of Oppie's great coups was to get Robert Serber, who had a speech impediment and spoke very quietly, to give the first briefing for everybody. I think it was called Serber Says, or at least...
And it's now published as the Los Alamos Primer.
Yeah, that's right. So in the very first week, or maybe even 2 weeks, everybody came up and sat and went to the auditorium at the other end of the hall from where our office was and listened to Serber, which was really sort of amazing because, as I say, this guy really didn't talk very well, but he could present it so well that it obviously was a very important part of getting the project together and getting them to think about what they were supposed to be doing.
What role did Manley play in the director's office during the war?
I don't think he played much of a role in the director's office during the war. He was busy with getting some machines going.
Okay. And
it was later that he and Robert got to be quite close, and Manley, and when Robert was trying to get things organized, get things done around the country, John would go out with him, and I don't know. I have a hard time talking about John Manley.
All right.
I mean, he's a very good guy who worked very hard for the country on a whole lot of things.
And he was the secretary of the General Advisory Committee when Oppenheimer was
That's
the
true.
chairman.
That's true. And I think that he was always a great supporter of Roberts. And I'm trying to remember how all the history of this. I'm sorry, I'm not doing very well.
How do you remember your wartime work at Los Alamos, and what do you take the most pride in?
Well, it's the most exciting. Unfortunately, that's what almost everybody says. It was a tremendous place, and it was marvelous to have this goal. And there were such great people there that it sort of was the most exciting time in your life, which makes you feel awful because it did such a bad thing. I mean, I don't think making an atomic bomb is a good thing.
Well,
my personal opinion. It can be argued.
Looking back on it, do you think the employment of the nuclear weapons over Japan was a mistake or not?
I don't know, and neither did the Japanese, and neither does anybody else. It's always the argument that it shortened the war, and it may have. And I guess the feeling the one thing I do agree with is if you have this thing, somebody should see it so they know what it will do. But whether you have to drop it on a large city like Nagasaki is a question, and I think it's going to be debated forever, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Let's go to the post-war years a little bit. How do you remember Oppenheimer today, and do you think he's accurately portrayed in some of the recent books?
Well, I unfortunately haven't read what's his name?
Kai Bird.
Kai Bird's, yeah. And it's probably supposed to be the most definitive, and it may be that, and I'm sorry I haven't read it, but I think on the whole he is. There's a guy named Jeremy Bernstein who's written some books about Robert. And he knows him quite well. He knew him well after the war as well as, and didn't know him during the war, he was too young. But I think he's said things about Robert that were true. And the trouble is that the hearings are what everybody's heard of, and it's colored lots of people's opinions, I guess. But I think he's coming into his own, all right. His reputation is not permanently damaged, I think.
All right. Tell me a little bit about the relationship, particularly the post-war relationship between Lawrence and Oppenheimer.
Gee, do I know anything about that?
Lawrence testified against Robert in the 1954 hearings.
Uh-huh.
Excuse me, he didn't. Alvarez did. He was invited to, and he was sick. You're right. He
Thank
did not.
you. That's because that didn't seem quite right to me, because Lawrence really was a great admirer of Oppenheimer's, but he also was a very conservative fellow, and I think it was very difficult for him to take care of, to absorb this communist business. But I don't think couldn't have imagined that he testified.
He was going to testify, and he had a medical problem that maybe got him off the hook. Alvarez testified.
Yes, and Alvarez was very definitely. I'm sorry, I'm not terribly. I know that Lawrence really admired Oppenheimer. My privacy shield. I'm not hanging my legs out anyway. Because Lawrence really did admire Robert, but Lawrence was a very straightforward fellow, and it was going to be hard for him to reconcile the communist stuff with the things that he really knew Robert could take care of, because the physics and that sort of thing. And so I think it was always a very difficult situation, but on the whole, I think that Lawrence really was on his side. He didn't think he was betraying the country, I'm quite sure, but I'm not absolutely.
Yes. Well, what happened? What went wrong after the war? Oppenheimer came out a national hero in 1945, and then he had this very serious problem in 1954, and
Well, there was a guy whose name I cannot now, who in Washington, D.C., who was an advisor to the Atomic Energy Commission, and I can't come up with his name right now. He was the one who was out to get Robert, and he was the one who publicized all this, and that was how the hearings got to be held.
there was Lewis Strauss, who was...
Strauss, yeah, thank you.
And then there was a Senate staffer named Borden who...
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think that's true, but I don't think he had an awful lot of influence. Well, maybe he did, I don't know.
How do you suppose Robert generated the animosity with Strauss, for example? Or Strauss generated it with Oppie?
No, it was the other way around. I don't think Oppie had much against Strauss. Well, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I did know something about this, and I just can't remember why it was that it was in the Atomic Energy Commission that their problems developed, and it may just have been something that Robert wanted to do, or, well, the super was certainly a big piece of it, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
I think that's really it. Anyway, Strauss really thought he had more influence than he should have, and worked on taking him down.
Yes.
If I say something that's absolutely wrong, you correct me, because it's perfectly possible.
Well,
because you've looked it up.
You're as close to
yeah, except that we're talking about
basics.
stuff that happened later, really. And the reason I know about it is that I paid attention, and that my husband was interested in it, and that sort of thing.
What question should I have asked you about working with Oppie that I didn't?
Well, I think you did pretty well. I can't think of any, because it was a very straightforward relationship, except that he was such a remarkable man, so you were always feeling that you were doing something for a remarkable man.
Did you keep in touch with him for the rest of his life?
Yeah.
Did you visit him at Princeton?
No, but I can. Let's see, I can remember. We used to go to New York, and we would go to the Algonquin, and I don't know whether the Algonquin is a great place to have a drink, and if you come in, you walk past the desk, and then you look down toward where the dining room is, and right under where the steps go up to the dining room, there's a table. And on Friday nights, we would assemble there with other people, with Jeremy Bernstein, and Robert came amazingly often, and brought Tony, his daughter, sometimes. And I think maybe Kitty came, although I don't really remember Kitty there. So I saw him there, and I saw him other places. I saw him in Pasadena when he was visiting the Bachers. That was later. And I remember seeing Kitty at a physics meeting in New York, but when she complained about my dress. Well, she was right. It gapped.
Okay. With that note, I think I'll open this to the audience for any comments or questions.
Scared him to death.
Yes.
Let me bring you a microphone so we can get all of this on the recording.
Thank you. I came to the laboratory in 1980, eventually worked in the weapons community, and I think I've always searched for what is the essence of Los Alamos. And I think I saw a glimmer of it when some fairly renowned visitors were here at the 40th anniversary of the laboratory. Mm-hmm. Edward Teller was giving a presentation, and his laser pointer broke down. He brought with him a large staff, walking stick, and Martin Rosenbluth handed that to him, and Teller used it as a pointer in place of the laser pointer. And I said, that's the essence of Los Alamos. They'll use anything at their disposal to get the job done. And I guess that SOP really stands for seat of the pants. So what I wanted to find out from you is, I apologize, I came in a little bit late. How did these great people that have left such an enormous legacy for us, how did they problem solve? Can you recall anything like that might be of interest?
How Oppenheimer rated people, or how he problems?
How did he problem solve with other people when difficulties came up? How did they arrive at new solutions? How did they work through problems?
Well, the vision I have when you ask that question really doesn't have much to do with it. That is, they would, all of them, whip out their slide rules. But he also discussed things with people very, very seriously. He had a governing board, and he would talk about some of these problems of the laboratory with the governing board, but then he would get people in and talk to them separately, and just work through it. He was a very good personnel administrator that way.
Perhaps a comment that I'd like to have you expand on. Oppenheimer argued strongly with Groves to permit a free and open scientific and technical discussions within the laboratory, and Groves was dead set in favor of compartmentalization. Oppenheimer prevailed, and I suspect that's...
it didn't last very long, that argument.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Oppenheimer prevailed almost immediately, I think.
Say a few words about the governing board. I think, though, that might be worthwhile. Who was on it? And
well, the heads of the departments, after we got to have them heads of departments, sorts of things. But there were also always about 8 or 10 people who were the ones who really were in charge of the various operations, and they came and they talked, and I think they did it once a week for a while, and I wrote minutes of them, which probably are in the Los Alamos archives somewhere. And, no.
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much. This has been really enjoyable.
Oh, very nice, thank you.
What was your degree in? And you mentioned that your mom kind of connected you to this opportunity. What would you have done?
My degree was political science.
Okay, so this applied then.
It had nothing to do with anything, yeah. I mean, I just got a BA, and then, that was just an education of sorts, but it was, and I knew how to spell, and compose a sentence, and those things were very useful. Well, I think. Well, I was kind of fierce about them.
Terry?
Well, I'd like to thank you for being here as well. My wife has occasion to come into contact with visitors from the Manhattan Project who come back to town, and she tells a story that I'd like to corroborate with you, or one of her customers tells a story I'd like to corroborate. This young man was an SED working in the lab somewhere, and there was some coffee crisis in the director's office, and Oppie couldn't find a cup of coffee, and so somebody called around and found him with his thermos full of coffee and sent Oppenheimer down to get a cup. Does that sound at all familiar to you?
Well, it's perfectly possible. I don't ever remember hearing it before.
You would have been the one calling. We have a question back here.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you again for being here. You mentioned that Oppie said that he was going to a beautiful place, which I assume was Los Alamos, which it is a most beautiful place. Can you recall your impressions and his impressions of the other side? The majority of the people that came to Los Alamos came from outside this area. What were the impressions of you all on the locals, the local people that are already here, particularly the Hispanics and the Native Americans? Thank you.
Well, we didn't talk back and forth very much, so the Hispanics didn't get to see these people very much because they stayed up here. But then they did go to Santa Fe. In fact, they went quite a lot to Santa Fe to shop and things. And as I recall, the person who knew about the impressions was Dorothy McKibben, and she said, it's a little hard to explain to these people, to the Santa Feans, that these people aren't all crazy. They were, for one thing, this is a group of exceedingly highly educated Europeans who mostly spoke other languages, and they were told not to speak other languages in Santa Fe. But they were exotic, very exotic for Santa Fe. And I think that Santa Fe, in the end, thought it was a great thing. There's no question about it. Not about the bomb, but about having the people here.
I have a couple of questions. It's a tremendously interesting presentation you gave today, and I greatly appreciate it. The first question is, I've done some reading of the reports that were written back during the Manhattan Project that have been declassified, and they've got tremendous amounts of detail and so forth. I was just wondering who typed those reports? This day and age, we have all of the software, of course. We're expected to do our own typing of our reports. Did the distinguished scientists do the typing, or was that left to the secretaries?
Did and the reports you're talking about were probably done late in 45 and that sort of thing. Don't you think so? When I stopped working and Marx came, then I can't stay away, so I got a job working for a fellow named David Hawkins, who was writing a history of Los Alamos. And I typed a lot of stuff for him, which was, a chemistry descriptions of procedures and that sort of thing. And that, I'm not sure what you're talking about, but that sounds like it.
Mm-hmm. The second question has to do with the Trinity Test itself. The morning that occurred, were you here in Los Alamos, or were you down at the Trinity site?
The Trinity, I'm sorry.
And did you happen to see the flash if you were here in Los Alamos, or could you relate to us the experience of the people that were here in Los Alamos that might have seen the flash that morning?
Well, lots of people wanted to go, and some people got to go to fairly close to it, where they really would be able to see the flash. I had a baby, and I was up. And I didn't see the flash, but I knew when it happened. And somehow, I don't remember how I knew when it happened, but I certainly did. I guess it was announced somehow. No, I don't know how I knew, but I certainly knew when it happened.
How did you know it was successful?
Well, I think Dick Feynman came up the street beating on a drum. I remember that very well. This is marvelous.
One question that occurred to me during the questions here, did you know Klaus Fuchs?
Yes.
What did you think of him?
He was a nice fellow. I didn't know him well because I didn't have a child who needed to be babysit by him, but I talked to him and I knew him, and he was a nice fellow.
Did he have much interaction with Oppenheimer?
I don't think so. I doubt that.
You were in the same building, I guess, with the T Division, were you not?
Yeah, I don't remember him in the laboratory. I only remember him outside in the town, sort of,
okay.
Which is funny.
Buck?
It's not funny.
Two questions. Do you have any interesting Dick Feynman stories? And secondly, can you say a little bit more about the social life in Los Alamos at the time? We've heard about great parties and really good martinis. Any comments?
Well, it really was a very active social life. It was also pretty drunken sometimes. But there was a small group of people, and they all knew each other, and they didn't have anything else to do. So, I'm not explaining that they were drunken. They weren't. But martinis did flow, and sometimes it was a little bit too much. But people had parties all the time. They had cooperative parties. Everybody brought something. Or they just had they had parties. And it was fun. I've never had such a good social life. but that was partly because there were lots of men and not many women. So.
Carol?
Priscilla, I'm here visiting from Livermore Lab and working on a history project there. I wondered if you'd be willing to share a little bit about the early friendship of Lawrence and Oppenheimer, who you already commented were quite different men, and what made them be such close friends, at least in those early days?
I'm trying to decide whether close friends is really a right word. Okay. But they greatly respected each other, and which is odd because, as you know, Lawrence isn't an Oppenheimer type at all. And I was always surprised at that. And when I worked first for Lawrence, and then I worked for Oppenheimer, and I was very much impressed with the fact that although Lawrence didn't appear to be someone who would admire or like Oppenheimer, he certainly did. There was no question about it. And the same thing was true of Oppie and Lawrence. I mean, they just knew, each one of them knew that the other one was a person to respect. But I wouldn't say that they were good friends. They weren't congenial in that way, if you know what I mean.
The second son of Lawrence is named after Robert Oppenheimer, so that's why I thought there was a quite close friendship.
You're sure that was where he got the Robert? Okay.
That's what his son told me, so I assume so.
Okay, well, I don't know.
But
I mean, it's a perfectly good name that you could.
Yeah, okay. Thank
My
you very
husband
much.
was named Robert.
What did you think of Lawrence? How was he to work with?
Sort of dull. I mean, I did not relate terribly well to Lawrence because I knew he was exceedingly conservative and I was certainly not. And the things he admired had to do with social situations and that sort of thing, and they weren't things that I admired. And so I worked for him, and he was fine, but I didn't work for him very long anyway.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could say something about Groves' plan to draft the scientists into the Army. I understand Oppenheimer actually even had a uniform for a lieutenant colonel being made.
Can you help me with that question? I couldn't quite hear it.
He'd like to know your views on Oppenheimer's original agreement that this would be a military base and the scientists would be military people, and that he understood that Oppenheimer already had a lieutenant colonel's uniform.
Well, it's true that he was sort of taken with this idea, and he went and got fitted. It maybe it had been Bob Bacher who talked him out of it, but at any rate, he became very strong on the subject of not being military. Not very, I mean, he really waffled very fast, is my recollection. But it's also true that he kind of thought it would be lovely to have a uniform. I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer. It doesn't reflect well on Oppenheimer, because it would have been a disaster. Nobody would have come.
Any other questions? Well, Priscilla, thank you very, very much.
Well, I must say I've enjoyed it.
Well,
Love to talk.
We have too. I want to suggest that if we pique your curiosity, you can find out much more about Priscilla Duffield from several of the recent books on Oppenheimer and wartime Los Alamos. I also want to acknowledge the people who really did much of the work in putting this session together. Paul White, Cecilia Olivas, and Corrine Ortiz of the Director's Office, and historians Roger Mead and Ellen Carr of IM9, and Yvonne Sanchez of the Protocol Office. And I personally want to thank IM Division Leader Kim Rousseau and IM9 Group Leader Henry Johnson for their hospitality and tolerance. And I particularly want to thank Priscilla Duffield and all of you for coming today and making this a very successful event.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. Just marvelous.